Hey everyone, welcome to Lawn and Garden Month on Echo Means Business. This month on E&B, we're doing a series of free webinars with leading brands and industry experts. For all sessions, you can go to echomeansbusiness.com. In this session, we're discussing the road ahead for regulatory actions with Sam Still from NALP, the National Associations of Landscape Professionals. We'll get right into it. Sam, how you doing?
Just fine.
Awesome. Sam's got a presentation for us today, and Sam, I'll let you jump right into it and show you slides.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon now, I guess, everybody. It's 12:01, and we're going to be talking about issues related to upcoming regulatory type activities that may be going on at the federal level that would impact the green industry, impacting lawn care firms, landscape construction, design build firms, and so forth. I get a lot of questions asked about the current regulations that relate to our industry. So hopefully today, when I do this program for you and when we get done, you'll have a better feel for what's involved in regulatory actions and maybe what's coming down the road. So if we can go to our first slide, we'll be ready to talk about the road ahead for regulatory action. And I would just draw your attention there on the side. You see under my title, being proactive and prepared is so important. So if we could go back to that slide, just there we go. Being proactive and prepared and not being surprised when a new regulation comes out. And we're going to be talking about some of them that appear to be a regulation that's under study at OSHA. And when in fact the final rule comes out, we don't want you to be surprised about that new regulation that impacts the work that you do. So let's move on to the second slide, please. So what drives new regulations from the federal level at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or what we term OSHA? Here are 5 things that really drive the new regulations that are coming down the road. First of all, OSHA will look at the data and statistics in the industry. What kinds of injuries and illnesses are occurring, how often, what equipment's involved, what kind of work are the employees doing when they're injured or become ill. So data and statistics, and I'll cover that more as we go through this. We want to look at a summary of annual violations. What types of citations are being issued out there by OSHA inspectors, and what are the fines associated with those violations? Because as you look at the violations, and they've been pretty much static for a number of years now, you'll probably get a feel for why new regulations may be put into effect. The third one on there, workplace hazard assessments, which is so important to landscape firms and landscape managers and so forth out there. Okay, there we are. So workplace hazard assessments, which is critical to OSHA also, because that's what you base all of your training on. You base the purchase and provision and requirement that your workers use personal protective equipment, or PPE. OSHA looks at the severity of the incidents. Are we talking about fatalities? Are we talking about illnesses, traumatic injuries, those kinds of things? And then, as with so many things that relates to regulations in our country, politics plays a role. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So under data and statistics, unfortunately for us, agriculture as an industry, which includes the landscape and horticultural services sector of the industry, it remains one of the most dangerous industries in the United States. And we're ahead of construction and mining in terms of the number of injuries and fatalities and illnesses that occur within our industry. So that puts us kind of as a target where OSHA will be looking at us for regulations, enforcing those regulations, and what new regulations down the road we're going to need. Just to give you an idea, the fatality rate in our industry, in the industry that we're in, and actually it's a little higher when you sort out certain occupations, like, for example, lawn care workers and tree care workers. But if you look at our fatality rate, it's 23 fatalities per 100,000 workers. And then the OSHA takes all of the industries together, transportation, agriculture. They look at construction, obviously, and they look at all these factory workers and so forth. When you merge all of those numbers together, the all industry rate is 3.4 worker fatalities per 100,000 workers. And you can see we're darn close to 8 times that within the agricultural industry and specific to our lawn care and landscape construction industry. And in fact, I was looking at some new data yesterday. Lawn maintenance is considered among the top 25 most dangerous jobs in the United States. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Under data and statistics also, landscape and horticultural services sector has a diverse group of hazards. Anytime you look at that diverse group of hazards, it requires obviously a lot of different types of training to keep your workers safe and healthy on the job. Among the ones that OSHA is most concerned about are slips, trips, and falls. In other words, putting in place at your business a fall protection system, fall protection program that would help reduce the number of injuries and fatalities from falls in the workplace. Noise is a serious problem at our work sites in the green industry because of the equipment, machinery, and so forth, and how closely your workers are working near that piece of equipment or wherever that loud noise is. Equipment and machinery, and whether that equipment and machinery has guarding and shielding on it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because that's very critical. A lot of citations and fines are issued by OSHA for equipment that's not properly guarded and shielded. It's either been removed, it's been damaged, it hasn't been replaced, or it's not in the proper location on the machine to give protection to the operator. Heat-related illness is a big one, and I think we're probably going to see some heat-related, heat stress types of regulations come down the road. They already have some very stringent heat stress and heat related illness prevention regulations in the state of California, which comes under Cal OSHA, but their federal OSHA is also looking at a specific standard related to heat related illnesses. We do have respirable silica dust that can be a serious problem within the landscape industry, particularly in the construction side, patio construction, where workers are cutting and working with paving blocks. They're working with bricks, they're working with concrete, they're working with sand. Any kind of product that has silica in it, when that silica is cut into or moved or blown around, it creates respirable silica dust. And that is a very big concern of OSHA at this point. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when it comes to respirator protection. So let's move on to the next slide. This is a summary of some of the most often cited violations. I would just mention to you that once a violation is received, in particular, a violation is received, there's often a fine associated with it. And those fines now are up around on a first time basis for a serious violation. The one-time fine is now about $14,000. If you had, for example, under this first one, personal protective equipment, not providing it, not purchasing it and providing it to your workers and requiring that they wear it, is written up a lot during inspections by OSHA inspectors who come in. So PPE is a very critical one. And OSHA has specified that the purchase of all personal protective equipment, with few exceptions like steel-toed shoes, for example, all other eye protection, hearing protection, head protection, respiratory protection, it's responsibility of the employer to purchase it based on what you found were the hazards that your workers would be exposed to, which we mentioned in a previous slide. And then you want to make sure that your crew managers, your crew leaders, and your management team be assured that the workers are actually wearing it and wearing it properly. So PPE shows up a lot. It's one of the most often cited violations that OSHA issues in our industry. And then I mentioned the general duty clause. General duty clause is really a kind of a catch-all where there may not be a specific standard related to the hazard that's been identified in the workplace. But if in fact that hazard, the hazard is not, has a specific standard, but it may be issued a citation because the workplace is not safe for your employees or your workers that are doing their landscape work, their lawn care work, or whatever it is. The key one next to is the HazCom program, deals with hazardous chemicals in the workplace. And the key word there is the first word I use on this slide, written. You have to have a written hazard communications program in order to, during an inspection, in order to pass that part of an inspection when the inspector comes in. It may be one of the first questions you'll have. Could I please see your written hazard communications or HazCom program? And just saying, well, we have one and all the workers know about it is not good enough. It needs to be in a written form. And the important thing is that all of your workers can understand that language that the HazCom program is in. So that's also a very important part of it that's been clarified over the last decade or so. We have quite a few citations issued for failures to keep the proper records. There still are a number of record keeping responsibilities that firms have. There's certain logs that need to be maintained and kept, and there are certain logs that need to be posted at the workplace. Right now, there's logs on the OSHA 300 log for injuries and illnesses in the workplace that were reported, the ones that were reported, and they're required to keep them kept in the workplace somewhere where the workers can see those between February 1st and April 30th. So you might want to look at, if you're not sure that you're meeting the mandates of record keeping regulations from OSHA, you might want to go to www.osha.gov and just put in record keeping and find out what the requirements are. But it does end up being one of the more important citations that's issued in our industry. I already mentioned machine guarding and shielding on equipment, and either missing, damaged, or not in the proper location. Sometimes I'll use an example, a zero-turn mower where the deflector shield on the end of the deck, mowing deck, has been pulled into an up position. It's no longer in a position where it can blow all of the debris and material downward, away from other workers, away from bystanders or so forth. Machine guarding and shielding, and that goes back a number of decades in the OSHA laws and standards. It's still being violated and we're still being written for it. So you want to make sure each day that that equipment goes out, that the equipment's in good condition and the guarding and shielding is in place. And then training programs get written up a lot in our industry. And here it's the lack of proper training programs. The way to prove that you're doing that is when you do a training program, be it, say, a weekly training you do at your facility before the workers go out, or tailgate or lunchbox type training at the site. Make sure everything is fully documented so that if you have an inspection, your training programs have been fully documented to include who was trained. In other words, the workers sign a sheet, the documentation sheet, what the topic was that they were trained on, when it was done, and who the trainer was. And then make sure you maintain those training records in your files for, I would say, at least 3 years, maybe preferably 5 years, so that you can prove that you are doing training in the areas where the hazards that impact your employees have been identified, prioritized, and the training is being done. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So the changing workplace environment, this is under workplace hazard assessments. I know a lot of firms from year to year. I was in the landscape business for 10 years in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And from year to year, we changed the scope of the work that we did. So when you change the workplace environment, I started doing more tree care work than lawn care work. And when I did that, that changed the whole realm and listing of hazards that my workers would be exposed to. So essentially, I was going with a new business model because of demand from my customers, the ones that wanted me to do both lawn care and tree work so they didn't have to hire two contractors. And so I developed a new business model, but at the same time, that was changing my workplace environment. It was changing some of the hazards that my workers were exposed to, and that meant different personal protective equipment. It also meant different training programs and so forth. So you want to keep pace with that. You want to be proactive again in that area, that if you're going into a new business model, taking on new types of work, make sure that you're also covering the safety and health program that you have in place. So you may have new customer work sites. Let me use an example. You've been doing a lot of commercial site maintenance of grounds maintenance work. And now you have one that has some fairly steep slopes. It may have water retention, ponds, streams on it. And that changes the whole scope of how you mow a site, especially when you're using some of the larger equipment, again, like zero-turn mowers. And how close do you want to get to those, what we call drop-offs, meaning the water retention areas, retaining walls and slopes and so forth. So when you get new customer work sites, you want to go back through that hazard assessment list that you had before and make sure that you've got the proper training in place, the proper PPE in place to cover that. New equipment and methods. There are new equipment, new pieces of equipment and methods being used out there. Particularly one area that I notice when I go to some of the green industry shows, new equipment being used in materials handling. So when you get into that area, and we'll talk more about that in reference to zero turns coming up, because that could be a new standard coming down the road fairly quickly. But when you've got new equipment and new methods being used, you're trying new materials handling equipment, make sure that you've got your safety programs, safety training programs in line to meet that new equipment and the new methods you're using, because they could change. And then, of course, and I just got a contact last week from one of our NALP members about how they are handling new employees and the lack of shortages of workers, and how they should handle working with a contractor who provides their employees for them. And that opens up a whole new can of worms about who's going to be doing their training, who's going to be providing their personal protective equipment, and so forth. So you want to make sure you have all agreements in place with a company that's providing you personnel on the job. Make sure you have all of the agreements in place, signed agreements with your subcontractor for employees prior to the time that you put these individuals to work on the job. Because if something happens, it's most likely that you're going to be responsible for the costs and fines and citations that are issued related to any violations of that worker's safety and health in the workplace. And then, of course, if you follow any of your state associations who get involved oftentimes in changes in local ordinances, there are issues related to safety and health about local ordinances. NALP often gets requests for input and assistance with new local ordinances that are being put into effect. And they do change the workplace environment, and they're all part of the workplace hazard assessments that need to be done. So let's go on to the next slide. OSHA will look at the severity of the incidents. And I just want to mention here, this would be a good time to mention that a lot of the fatal injury incidents you see there at the top of my list, a lot of times these are unwitnessed. There are no witnesses to that incident. And if somebody had seen it happen and could have rendered first aid and been the first responder on the scene quickly, the fatal injury may have been a serious injury, but the person's life might have been saved. But oftentimes they're fatal injury incidents, and the victim of the incident's not found till later. OSHA, it looks very closely at incidents involving amputations and loss of an eye. And on these three, let me go back to fatal injury incidents. Once you know of a fatal injury incident to an employee within your firm, you've got 8 hours to notify the local or regional OSHA office about that incident. and you can be cited for not providing that timely report to the OSHA office. So again, it's 8 hours for a fatal injury incident that occurred while the individual, a victim, was your employee at your job site. And then under amputations and loss of an eye, you have 24 hours to report either of those to the local or the regional OSHA office. And in fact, fatal injury incident will probably trigger an inspection fairly quickly. Amputations and loss of an eye type incident may also trigger an inspection based on those types of injuries. If you have multiple injury collisions, and what we're seeing is OSHA is interested in it, but usually it's the Department of Transportation that gets involved in multiple injury or fatality collisions. Your vehicle's out there taking your employees to a job site, typically pulling a trailer with the equipment they're going to be using. And unfortunately, there have been a rash of those within the last several years. And OSHA's taking a very close look at these multiple injury collisions and incidents involving your work vehicles. And then I've already mentioned long-term exposures. And the reason why I've singled these out under severity is once you've suffered injury to your hearing, usually that's permanent. And once you've had employees that have been subjected to respirable silica dust, a lot of times the injury to the lungs is permanent. But these things occur over long term, and noise, the loss of hearing through occupational exposure is often something that can't be, you can't get that. You can obviously go to hearing aids and so forth, but with noise and silica dust, they're of concern to OSHA because usually the long-term exposures result in permanent injuries or illness. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So here's the politics of this whole thing that's one of the driving forces behind new regulations. And for obviously decades, since before OSHA was even founded, and in 1970, 71, during the Nixon administration, when OSHA was organized and the first OSHA standards were being promulgated and enforced, worker organizations and unions have played a major role in the safety of their members. And so politics, I put that under the politics category, but it's obviously something that's very important to worker safety and health, what the unions and worker organizations have done through the years to protect their workers. There is a recognition of underserved populations in our industry. This recognition goes back probably when I first started teaching the OSHA HAZCOM program back in 1988. There was concern then that there were underserved populations of, in the industry I was studying, of workers from Mexico, Latino workers who weren't getting the proper training and certainly weren't getting their training in a language that they could understand. So politics, I place it under the politics, but it's certainly important to those workers who were working under conditions where they really didn't understand how to protect themselves from the hazards they were exposed to. And then depending on usually, and I will not single out individual political parties, but oftentimes with the party that's in the White House at that time, there's either more activity in promulgating and putting out new standards from one party versus another party. At the current time, we're more likely to see an emphasis on employee safety and more regulations. And then at other times, depending on the political party that's in the White House, in control of Congress, we're likely to see less emphasis on employee safety and health. So I list that under my politics category. But right now, I think, and as you're going to see from several slides I have coming up, there is renewed interest on putting more employee safety and health standards into effect. And I'll kind of run down the list of the ones that I see that we're going to see more of. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So the potential, and this may be the reason why many of you came online today to look at the potential for new regulations coming down the road. Skid steer loaders. Most firms either own them or they can rent them from equipment dealers very easily, day to day, week to week, or lease the equipment. But there is a genuine active look at skid steer loaders. Skid steer loaders, and I looked at the standard as of this morning, and I printed out something for you. And what I'd like to do is, I don't normally do this, but let me read this to you because maybe some of you have already heard that OSHA was looking at a new standard on skid steer loaders. And as of this morning, from the OSHA website, let me just read one sentence here. It says, the promulgation, which would be the establishment and putting into effect new standards. So the promulgation of specific rules for compactors and rubber-tired skid steer equipment is reserved pending consideration of standards currently being developed. So as of this morning, there's still a lot of interest, and there's still looking at the development of a separate standard for skid steer loaders. And it has a lot to do with the number of injuries, go back to the number of injuries and fatalities involved with skid steer loaders at the work site. So I honestly believe that we're going to be looking at a skid steer standard. Length of time, who knows, but you can keep up to date on that by looking at the www.osha.gov website. And if you just go under skid steers, after the website, just put skid steer loaders, a lot of information will come up and give you an indication of where we are with that new standard. And sometimes they happen. And I also need to mention that sometimes a lot of these go through a public comment period. They go through the development period. They go through the almost right up to the final rule. And then they never get promulgated or put into effect. So that can happen also. But right now, OSHA is seriously looking at a separate standard for skid steer loaders. Also, the second one, heat-related illness. Right now, we have just completed, as of January the 26th, what was called an extended comment period for heat-related illnesses. This would have to do with heat stress for landscape workers, lawn care workers, and so forth, and other workers who work outside. This is a heat-related illness, but I believe it's also going to cover workers who work in an inside environment. What we're interested pretty much for most of us would be the heat-related illnesses impacting our workers outside at landscape sites. Right now, as of the end of the extended comment period, which is normally 90 days, it was extended further, and like I said, January 26th it ended. As of this morning, I couldn't find any of the results of that extended comment period, but I would keep my eyes open for something on the OSHA website or in what's called, and most of you maybe accessed the Federal Register. A lot of these things come out in the Federal Register, so you want to stay on top of this one, because I believe we're also going to see a heat-related illness standard down the road, and it'll probably be pretty similar to what exists at Cal OSHA in the state of California. You may be familiar with the global harmonization terminology. This has to do with hazard communications and hazardous chemicals in the workplace. There are updates. Global harmonization has been in effect now for about 8 to 10 years since they made a change. What this does is to define global harmonization is to put the United States more in line with what other countries are doing in terms of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. It's standardized. If most of you remember the old MSDS or material safety data sheets, they're now called safety data sheets or just SDS. And what global harmonization did was it updated all of those former material safety data sheets to safety data sheets in one standardized format. And it makes it much easier for you as an employer, if you're using hazardous chemicals in the workplace, it makes it much easier for you to look at these MSDSs, make sense out of them, and put into effect training programs that protect your workers. So the global harmonization updates, they come out on a fairly regular basis. They just clarify what the regulation says, and they may give a new interpretation. Interpretations are usually based on a company or a firm or, say, a trade association representing, for example, us, would contact OSHA and say, we need an interpretation of certain parts of the new regulations that came out or the new regulations that went into effect 5 years ago. And it may take a while to get feedback from OSHA, but somebody in that area, be it construction or be it somebody in the horticultural lawn care side, will get back to you with an interpretation letter about what that standard really means. So you want to keep up to date on what the OSHA interpretations are. And again, they can be found at that www.osha.gov website. Obviously, for 2 years or more now, we've been impacted by COVID. And there's probably going to be, maybe not a standard, but there's certainly an awful lot of alerts that have been issued for COVID. I know NALP members have been really good about sharing ideas about how they're trying to control worker exposure to COVID, to keep their workers safer at the job site, back at their offices and so forth. So you want to stay on top of COVID and infectious diseases. Usually get up in the morning here in State College, where I'm coming from, and look at the news. It's pretty depressing because now there's another surge of a new type of COVID over in the Far East. Hopefully that won't make it to the U.S., but if history's any indication, we may be looking at another type of surge. I hope not. That's not my field, my expertise area. But anyway, COVID and infectious diseases would be an emphasis area for OSHA. And then recently, as late fall, early winter, as an OSHA instructor, I'm required to take update training every 3 years or so. And I noticed that OSHA was putting a bigger emphasis on evaluation, how our programs are evaluated, the tools and methods that are used to evaluate the effectiveness of the training that you're doing. And what you want as a company, as a firm out there within our industry, obviously the time and money you spend on evaluation, your weekly evaluation training program, your weekly tailgates and so forth, hopefully they've been effective in changing worker behaviors, getting workers to wear their PPE, wear it properly, to operate their equipment more safely and so forth. And so OSHA seems to be putting an emphasis. We haven't seen anything in terms of more formal, how do you evaluate your training programs? But we could down the road see OSHA require that your training be better evaluated for effectiveness. Like I'm required now when I do an OSHA program online or what's called a video conference, I'm required to submit 3 different levels of evaluation about the students who attended my program. What did they know when they came into the program? What did they know when they left the training program? And then follow up, or what they call impact evaluation, say 30 to 60 days down the road. You'll get a pretty good feel if you just go out and observe work crews in terms of after they've been trained about whether they're following what the training suggested to keep them safe and healthy, just by observing whether they're wearing their respirator correctly, whether they're wearing the proper eye protection rather than fancy sunglasses. So anyway, evaluation tools and methods could well be something that OSHA is going to require us to do a little bit better job of. And then just recently, if you go on the OSHA website, there are a number of references now to employee retaliation or employer retaliation against employees who either refuse to work at a work site because of the dangers involved, at least the dangers they perceive. So there's a lot of clarifications at OSHA right now that have been issued about clarifying all of their standards and requirements within their standards. They do have requirements that say that a worker can't be retaliated against. And there's a whole list of things that are considered to be retaliation, that a worker can't be retaliated against for refusing to work or drawing attention to an unsafe condition. And if a worker has a near miss, close call type incident, I think I would encourage them to get back to management, let their crew leader, crew manager know about that close call. And those types of things are very important to the industry, and keeping this whole area of retaliation and what's going on to a minimum, so that you don't get an inspection because of a complaint for retaliation from one of your employees. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So here's a summary of some of the driving force things we talked about today and how this process works. We could spend hours on talking about the full regulatory process itself, but the regulatory development process is lengthy. And I would just like to go, I mentioned to you that I believe we will probably see a skid steer loader standard down the road. I can't tell you when that would be, but there's still a lot of interest and a lot of work going on at OSHA in DC to put into effect a standard on that equipment. I would draw your attention to the fact that back in 1998, there was a NIOSH alert issued. NIOSH is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which is part of the Centers for Disease Control. Please don't confuse that with OSHA, but NIOSH does research. NIOSH does a lot of education and training materials, and they do what's called an alert. They do them when it's needed. And in 1998, they did an alert called Preventing Injuries and Deaths from Skid Steer Loaders. That alert then was revised in 2011, which would have been 13 years later. And so between 1998, when the first alert came out from NIOSH about injuries and deaths from skid steer loaders, we're now at 2022. So it's been 24 years since the original alert. And I'm not, it's not being critical, but I think now because the number of incidents, the number of traumatic incidents involving skid steers are not declining. If anything, they're increasing. We're probably going to see that standard finally put into effect. So regulatory development process is lengthy, as you can see from some of the examples I've given you, and it does take time. And some of these you will see in promulgated, meaning they will be put into effect and enforced, and some of them down the road may not. Again, politics could well play a role in that. The second one here, public comment periods often are extended, like they were with the heat-related illness, which original public comment period under the heat-related illness standard ended back in the fall. Then it was extended again until January the 26th. And we're in a waiting period right now to find out what the public comment period, public comments from people, and anybody can comment on it, what the public comment period said, what the responses were, and will that in fact change the writing and the wording of the proposed standard. And then the final rule, which is the just before it's promulgated and put into effect, you may see significant changes based on the public comment period and other changes that are done. So the OSHA.gov website, again, is valuable to you for looking at interpretations of current standards, proposals for new standards coming down the road. And the only other one I would mention to you, and I've already said it, the Federal Register is important to follow through with the Federal Register and see what they're also saying. And it comes out daily. And there's new information there from OSHA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Labor. So when you look under U.S. DOL, Department of Labor, you'll find the OSHA, a lot of the OSHA government information that's current on a daily basis. So I would definitely stay in tune with those and have somebody within your organization staying up to date on those type of OSHA regulations. I think that was my last slide. And at this point, if there's anybody who has any questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions I can. I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I like to pride myself in being able to contact somebody who has those answers and get back to you. So if I don't, I've got pencil and paper here to take notes. And if I have an email address for you, I'll be glad to get back to you. And again, I would remind you that Kim McCrossan at the National Association of Landscape Professionals, our Director of Education, she also knows how to get in touch with me on a daily basis. And another thing I like to do is we like to get back to people quickly, because if you have a question, it's usually pretty important. It's important right then. So I see we have a comment there, JAR Landscaping LLC. We see so many accidents due to skid steers, and that's obviously OSHA does too, because they're looking at the statistics. It definitely sounds like a new standard will help a lot. I would mention and respond, I didn't indicate to you what they find when they come in and do an inspection, and they will usually do one where a fatality is involved. They find an awful lot of bypassed safety monitoring equipment, like they bypass a lot of skid steers have their interlocking systems bypassed. Also, some of them have had the rear warning, backup warning sounding device disconnected. And that's why so many of those incidents are related to those bypassing type incidents, bypassing the safety engineered equipment that was put on the skid steer. So that becomes a big problem. And when OSHA finds that during an inspection, the fines can be significant.
Oh, Sam, I just want to jump in on the skid steer conversation. In Massachusetts, you have to hold a hydraulics license in order to operate even a skid steer, to rent it, to borrow it. And again, even with that standard in Massachusetts, there's still loopholes where guys will go to New Hampshire where you don't have to be licensed and they'll drive it into the state. Does that standard maybe include some tough test moving forward, or is that just to the point where the training per entity would have to be a little stricter through companies?
You broke up there just a little bit towards the end of that. Can you just give me the end, Josh, of what you just said, please?
Yeah. So would the standard pertain to the companies having a stricter training policy, or would it be more of the licensing through the state?
The bottom line, Josh, is that it's going to be the company. The company is going to be the responsible agent, the responsible organization. They're the employer. They're the ones that have to enforce. Massachusetts, I think, is an OSHA plan state. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And that when I mentioned the heat stress, heat-related illness standard in California, California is an OSHA plan state also, and they call it Cal OSHA. But in Massachusetts, back to your question, it's going to fall back on, and almost always does, the employer. What did you enforce that in terms of local standards, state standards that were in place, and certainly, obviously, the federal standard. So the employer is going to be responsible if something happens in the workplace. And if it's a fatality, like I indicated to you, it's most likely going to trigger an inspection fairly quickly. And then the whole process of issuing citations and fines and so forth will follow after that. So does that answer your question? Does that kind of get to the, yeah. So again, the employer is going to be the responsible party.
Yeah. It seems like it always comes down to it in general. I've had colleagues in trouble with guys that aren't licensed in the state. They were fined. Obviously, OSHA had come into the picture, and they found a few other violations, and the fines weren't paid off. Probably about $20 or $30 worth of fines. I want to jump into.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Go ahead.
You said something there that's also critical in terms of an inspection. If the inspection is about a fatality involving skid steer, say, for example, or multiple injuries due to a skid steer incident or any incident, OSHA, when they come in to do the inspection, can actually inspect for anything else. So if they were to walk through the shop, let's say, for example, Josh, the machine that was involved in the incident is now stored in the shop area, and they go in, do an inspection. They're looking for bypass equipment and safety equipment and so forth. And they spot a grinder, for example, on a workbench that doesn't have the proper tool rest or the guarding and shielding on it. That's fair game. And they don't find a fire extinguisher in there that's in a location that workers can access easily. That's fair game. So any other violations beyond what they came to look at is also fair game. And something you said triggered me to remind all of our listeners and viewers that they need to be aware of that.
And regulations and standards in place now are available on OSHA.gov, OSHA.com right now?
Excuse me?
All those regulations and standards that are in place as of today, those are available to review on OSHA's website?
Yes, they are. Absolutely.
Okay.
It looks like when you print all of that out, because I just went through my update training to be an OSHA trainer, it looks like a huge metropolitan phone book. It's massive. And it's broken down. Something I should mention, the standard is broken down for our industry. We have to comply with two standards. One is the 1926 construction standard. And that applies to companies that do more landscape construction, design, build, patio work, and so forth. And then the other standard is the standard that's the general industry standard. And that one applies more to lawn care firms, those doing maintenance and so forth. So you've got the construction standard and the general industry standard. And some companies have to comply with both.
Okay. I wanna ask one more question. The landscape and hardscape side, and that's something you mentioned with silica dust regulations. A lot of the manufacturers of tools have been coming up with different scenarios to try to eliminate or come up with dust suppression. I've heard through the room when an OSHA officer or a Department of Labor comes in, and if there's someone that's dry cutting and allowing dust to go into the atmosphere and around the job site, you are fined for not only the initial violation, employee or person on that job site. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's that particular respirable dust standard, especially with respirable silica dust. The recommendation is from OSHA that wet saw technology be used. In other words, a cutting saw, a paver block cutting concrete type saw would have a water reservoir on it and a way for introducing that water at the blade where all of the dust is generated. It has to be obviously operating and not jammed up or with a material in it. And if the worker, then there's what kicks in next is with that dust is how many hours is the worker exposed to that dust. And if it's lesser hours, I believe the number is under 4 hours per workday, then a respirator on the individual, if wet saw technology is being used, a respirator would not be required. However, if that's all this individual on the work site does, they just cut and another worker picks it up and takes it over. Let's say they're doing insulation of a patio with paver blocks. If that person, all they're doing on the job site is cutting, and they do it all day long, then they would also, in addition to the wet saw technology that's required, they would also have to be wearing a respirator to filter out those respirable silica dust.
The vacuum systems that you see that attach to the cutoff saw themselves, are those considered OSHA compliant where you're not actually using a wet cell to suppress the dust?
Yes, they are. Usually you see those used more in an inside environment because getting the dust out of that inside environment where the dust is kind of accumulating around that work site. But yeah, you'll see a reference in the standard to vacuum systems also being used. I would just say to you that from my experience, they're outside, They're not as reliable because of the air movement outside and so forth.
No.
They're not as reliable as wet saw technology, where water's introduced right where the dust is generated. And then the one thing that I would mention as a follow up to that would be that just had a phone call there, had to turn off.
Right.
As a follow up to that, when the worksite cleanup is being done, you want to make sure that if somebody comes in with a backpack type blower and they're blowing all this material around to clean up the worksite, you don't want to reintroduce the respirable dust. So you want to make sure that when that's cleaned up, that it's wet. It's wet when it's cleaned up, and the dust is not reintroduced into the environment.
Yeah. Do you have a ballpark idea of how much that fine is? The reason why I asked this is because I know a lot of the viewers that will come back and watch this are hardscape or landscape professionals. And I see a lot on social media, the guys will post their work, beautiful work, but you'll see that cloud of dust just drifting off behind them. And I think I want people to understand that, well, first, the severity of silica, what it can do to your body, and two, the investments surpass the fine 100 times over to me. So
for the most part, when OSHA issues a citation and fines are attached to it, every year in January, the amount of the first time fine goes up. So currently it's just over $14,000 for the first time serious violation fine. And it went up from, it was just under 14,000 in 2021, and now it's over 14,000 for the first time violation. The critical thing about that is that, let's say you had 3 workers out doing some type of landscape construction or lawn maintenance work, and none of the 3 workers, let's say you had a 3-person crew, and none of the 3 workers were wearing the proper PPE, and the hearing protection, eye protection, respiratory protection. So the fine is per violation per worker. So you would take $14,000 times 3 if none of the 3 workers none of the PPE standard was being enforced by the crew manager, who may be also violating it themselves. So anyway, the fines are significant. And I would mention to you and the viewers, it's very critical that if you get a citation letter and there are fines there, that you request what's called the informal meeting, and you have a set number of days to get that informal meeting request submitted to OSHA. And then when that's submitted, you go in and you talk about how you're going to eliminate or mitigate the hazard that you were cited for. And that usually then, in fact, gets the fine significantly reduced. So a $14,000 fine. I was involved in a situation in Florida where one landscape firm was cited under 4 separate citations on a maintenance contract they had with the interstate system in Florida. So the total fines at one time were close to $42,000. Once they requested the informal meeting, went in and talked about how they were going to do a safety stand down, and they were going to do increased training and enforce certain personal protective equipment standards. The fine was reduced from $42,000 down to just over $10,000.
Oh, wow.
So it pays to request that meeting and go in and talk to OSHA and spend the time to do it. And I would suggest you go in the right frame of mind. Don't go in try to pick a fight with them, because you won't win that fight.
I guess study the guidelines and invest in the PPE and the equipment to avoid it all together would be the upside. So I'm going to move slightly over to the lawn care side of it. And I think my biggest question is fuel cans, gas cans. And I've seen time and time again in my neighborhood, you'll see a guy with 3 mowers on his trailer and a rack of like 7 or 8 gas cans. I don't think that a lot of the gas cans that guys buy are OSHA compliant, from my understanding. We use the steel cans, and they're caged off in either a ventilated area in an enclosed trailer or on a dump truck with the cage. Can you just touch base on the difference with, plastic cans you would get at Home Depot or Quick Stop versus the steel cans?
Okay, well, OSHA follows NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association standards for this, and you'll see it right in their in the standards that they have in construction and in lawn maintenance. There are two critical things. One, OSHA does not allow plastic gasoline cans. Plastic cans are not part of the standard and are specifically not allowed according to the OSHA standard. So the steel cans that are certified, NFPA certified type cans. And the other thing I should mention is that if there was an incident involving cans that are in the bed, say of a truck, and they're sliding around and creating friction with the bed of the truck, steel cans on the bed of the truck, and a fire was to result, that would probably result in a citation also. So they talk about making sure all of the fuel canisters, the fuel containers, be metal containers that are properly certified, and there'll be a label on there saying that, and that they're in one way or another confined to a certain area so they can't slide around in the bed of the truck.
All right. Now, and if, let's say, a company was on a commercial site, OSHA comes in to investigate something on that commercial site, and they notice that this lawn care company a ton of open gas cans or gas cans in the bed, are they able to approach that person? Because I see that as a realistic possibility that OSHA could be at a job site for one thing and then identify this.
Yeah, specifics to it in terms of, you mentioned open gas cans or containers. I could see if they created a hazard for the workers in that crew or people nearby or so forth. That's kind of, Josh, where the standard kicks. There's another standard called the general duty clause, and that typically ends up being either number 1 or number 2 on our citation list every year. It covers everything that's not covered by specific standards, and I could see a company being written up for that. It's important to make sure that when the individual is refueling, the standard talks about suggesting, I don't think it's a requirement, but recommending that the equipment be allowed to cool for 5 minutes or so before refueling is attempted. I don't know whether in your firm or not has commercial size zero turn mowers. Usually the tanks are large enough that if you fill them in the morning, they're going to last most of the day. So refueling is not something you do on the job, but maybe for smaller equipment, you have to refuel during the day. But again, I'll go back to anything that violates another standard, which may not be the real reason why they're there, is free game. And it could be that you would be cited for something that you weren't expecting to be cited for. And keep in mind that general duty clause.
Information. I think a lot of people are going to get some value out of that because, like I said, I've seen guys with 10 to 15 5-gallon gas cans driving up and down the street, not secure, and that was one of the important things, because I know a lot of guys tend to use, a lot of the companies they see on social media, they'll grab those cans just because of the efficiency of them, but obviously steel cans are the way to go, safer, and it's within the guideline.
Yeah, and I just would go back to, if something I've said today was not really clear to anybody that was part of the program today, make sure you use that www.osha.gov website. I just referred to the NFPA, for example. And then there's certain ANSI, ANSI standards. They're all in the OSHA standard and references to those. And the ANSI standard applies to things like eye protection, for example. There's an ANSI Z87.1 that should be on all protective eyewear that's approved for use in work sites. And knowing where to look for that ANSI Z87.1 or that ANSI standard. There's also a standard for hard hats for the tree care industry and for others in need of hard hats. If you're working on the ground crew in a tree care site, hard hats are required as part of the regulation and the construction standards. So there's all those references to standards that have been developed by research organizations like ANSI, NFPA, and so forth are actually on the OSHA.gov website also.
Okay. I have a ton of questions, but I know we got to start wrapping it up. We're getting around that 1 hour mark. Could you just drop maybe the websites or addresses where wanted to reach out to you or one of your colleagues to answer any questions that weren't answered on the forum, they can reach out.
Yeah, obviously the www.nalp.org website, and specific name Josh. Kim McCrossan is our education director, and she's the individual that I coordinate all of my training programs with. And Kim will get me within a very short period of time any responses that people may have.
All right, perfect. And guys, you can also follow the NALP program that feeds up there with some tips and some shows. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to follow Echo Means Business on IG and Facebook. Visit Echo Means Business for all the sessions, and we'll see you at the next one Tuesday when they talk about tool and maintenance with Corona tools and solving plant problems with proven winners. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today and putting out all this value you did.
Thanks, Josh.
No problem.